A homeland or Bantustan refers to a territory set aside for black South Africans during the Apartheid era in South Africa. The policy of creating homelands was a key component of apartheid's racial segregation and discrimination. The term Bantustan is derived from Bantu, an umbrella term used during apartheid to describe black Africans. The apartheid government aimed to establish separate territories for different ethnic groups within the black population, considering each ethnic group as a nation with its homeland. Black South Africans were classified into different ethnic groups, and each group was assigned a designated homeland based on the predominant ethnicity of its population. The homelands were granted nominal independence by the apartheid government, but in reality they were economically dependent on South Africa. Black South Africans living in the homelands were stripped of their South African citizenship and became citizens of the specific homeland to which they were assigned. Homelands were often economically unviable and lacked resources. Many inhabitants were forced to seek employment in South Africa, leading to the creation of a cheap labor force. The establishment of homelands involved forced removals of black communities from their ancestral lands to the designated territories, often against their will. Black communities resisted the establishment of homelands, viewing them as a strategy to perpetuate racial segregation and deny them equal rights in the broader South African context. The creation of homelands was widely condemned internationally as a strategy to legitimize apartheid policies and maintain white minority rule. Examples of homelands. The Transkei homeland was designated for the Xhosa-speaking population. It was granted nominal independence in 1976 but was not internationally recognized. Bophuthatswana was designated for the Tswana-speaking population. It was granted nominal independence in 1977. The Ciskei homeland was created for the Xhosa-speaking population. It was granted nominal independence in 1981. Venda was designated for the Venda-speaking population. The policy of creating homelands was widely criticized and condemned. As apartheid came to an end in the early 1990s, the homelands were dismantled. With the end of apartheid, the inhabitants of the former homelands were reintegrated into South Africa, regaining their South African citizenship. The establishment of homelands resulted in the forced displacement of millions of people, causing social, economic, and cultural disruption. Homelands stand as a symbol of the apartheid regime's discriminatory policies and the injustices suffered by black South Africans during that era. The concept of homelands remains a painful chapter in South Africa's history, representing a systematic attempt to divide and control the black population along ethnic lines. The dismantling of homelands was a critical step toward building a more unified and inclusive South Africa. During the apartheid era in South Africa, the government implemented a range of policies that included the enactment of laws and the use of specific vocabulary to enforce racial segregation and discrimination. Many of the terms and phrases used during this period reflected the apartheid government's attempts to justify and institutionalize racial hierarchy. Here are some key vocabulary terms used under apartheid. Bantu education, a system of education designed for black South Africans, emphasizing vocational training and designed to perpetuate racial inequality. Bantustan, a designated homeland or territory for a specific ethnic group, intended to separate different black communities based on their ethnic backgrounds. Homeland, similar to Bantustan, referring to a territory set aside for black South Africans based on ethnic classification. Population Registration Act, legislation that classified South Africans by race, creating the racial categories of white, black, colored, and Indian. Group Areas Act, legislation that designated specific geographic areas for different racial groups, leading to enforced segregation in residential areas. Pass laws, laws that required non-white South Africans to carry passbooks, restricting their movement and determining where they could live and work. Separate Amenities Act, legislation that enforced the segregation of public facilities such as bathrooms, parks, and transportation based on racial classifications. Job reservation, policies that reserved certain jobs and professions for white South Africans, limiting opportunities for non-white citizens. Pencil test, a discriminatory test used to determine a person's racial classification. A pencil was placed in the individual's hair, and if it fell out, they were classified as white. Petty apartheid, referring to the everyday, Smaller-scale instances of segregation such as separate benches, buses, and entrances for different racial groups. Grand Apartheid, referring to the broader, more comprehensive policies of apartheid, including the establishment of homelands and population classification. Immorality Act, legislation that criminalized interracial relationships and marriages. Mixed Marriages Act, legislation that prohibited marriages between people of different races. Group Areas Development Act, legislation that provided for the removal of people living in areas designated for other racial groups. Security police, law enforcement agencies responsible for suppressing anti-apartheid activities often involved in the arrest and torture of activists. State of emergency, periods during which the government declared a state of emergency to suppress protests and dissent, giving security forces expanded powers. Township, urban areas designated for non-white South Africans, often characterized by overcrowded and inadequate living conditions. These terms reflect the legal and social framework that institutionalized racial segregation and discrimination during the apartheid era in South Africa. The use of such vocabulary was part of the systemic effort to justify and enforce racial hierarchy and division.